Edward William Brooke III, born October 26, 1919, to January 3, 2015, was an American Republican politician. In 1966, he became the first African American popularly elected to the United States Senate. He represented Massachusetts in the Senate from 1967 to 1979. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., Brooke graduated from the Boston University School of Law after serving in the United States Army during World War II. After serving as chairman of the Finance Commission of Boston, Brooke won election as Massachusetts Attorney General in 1962. In 1966, he defeated Democratic Governor Endicott Peabody in a landslide to win election to the Senate. He co-wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which prohibits housing discrimination. Brooke became a prominent critic of President Richard Nixon and was the first Senate Republican to call for Nixon's resignation in light of the Watergate scandal. Brooke won re-election in 1972, but he was defeated by Paul Tsongas in 1978. After leaving the Senate, Brooke practiced law in Washington, D.C., and was affiliated with various businesses and nonprofits. In his early years, Brooke was commissioned as an officer, served 5 years in the Army, saw combat in Italy during World War II as a member of the segregated 366th Infantry Regiment, and earned a Bronze Star Medal. The 366th Infantry Regiment was an all-African American segregated unit of the United States Army that served with distinction in both World War I and World War II. The unit was one of the exceptional Negro units with all its own officers and personnel. The U.S. military did not desegregate until after World War II, and in most of the segregated units, all field grade and most of the company grade officers were white. During World War II, the unit saw combat in Italy as part of the 92nd Infantry Division, 5th Army. In Italy, Brooke met his future wife, Remigio Ferrari Scacco, with whom he had 2 daughters, Remai and Edwina. Following his discharge, Brooke graduated from the Boston University School of Law in 1948. "I never studied much at Howard," he reflected, "but at Boston University, I didn't do much else but study." His papers are stored at Boston University's Howard Gottlieb Archival Research Center. In 1962, he was the first elected African American Attorney General of any state. In this position, Brooke gained a reputation as a vigorous prosecutor of organized crime and corruption, securing convictions against a number of members of the Ferkolo administration. An indictment against Ferkolo was dismissed due to lack of evidence. He also coordinated with local police departments on the Boston Strangler case, although the press mocked him for permitting an alleged psychic to participate in the investigation. His career as a U.S. Senator began in 1966 when Brooke defeated former Governor Endicott Peabody with 1.2 million votes to 744,000 and served as a United States Senator for 2 terms, from January 3, 1967 to January 3, 1979. The black vote had, Time wrote, no measurable bearing on the election as less than 3% of the state's population was black, and Peabody also supported civil rights for blacks. Brooke said, "I do not intend to be a national leader of the Negro people," and the magazine said that he condemned both Stokely Carmichael and Georgia's Lester Maddox as extremists. His historic election gave Brooke a 50-state constituency, a power base, that no other senator can claim. Brooke, who supported Michigan Governor George W. Romney and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller's bids for the 1968 GOP presidential nomination against Richard Nixon's, often differed with President Nixon on matters of social policy and civil rights. In 1967, Brooke was awarded the Spingarn Medal from the NAACP. By his second year in the Senate, Brooke had taken his place as a leading advocate against discrimination in housing and on behalf of affordable housing. With Walter Mondale, a Minnesota Democrat and a fellow member of the Senate Banking Committee, he co-authored the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination in housing. The act also created HUDs, Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, as the primary enforcer of the law. President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act into law on April 11th, 1 week after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Dissatisfied with the weakened enforcement provisions that emerged from the legislative process, Brooke repeatedly proposed stronger provisions during his Senate career. In 1969, Congress enacted the Brooke Amendment to the federal publicly assisted housing program, which limited the tenants' out-of-pocket rent expenditure to 25% of their income. During the Nixon presidency, Brooke opposed repeated administration attempts to close down the Job Corps and the Office of Economic Opportunity, and to weaken the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, all foundational elements of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. In 1969, Brooke spoke at Wellesley's College's commencement against coercive protest and was understood by some students as calling protesters elite ne'er-do-wells. Then student government president Hillary Rodham departed from her planned speech to rebut Brooke's words, affirming the indispensable task of criticizing and constructive protest, for which she was featured in Life magazine. Brooke was a leader of the bipartisan coalition that defeated the Senate confirmation of Clement Haynsworth, the president's nominee to the Supreme Court. A few months later, he again organized sufficient Republican support to defeat Nixon's second Supreme Court nominee, Harold Carswell. Nixon next nominated Harry A. Blackmun, who was confirmed and later wrote the Roe v. Wade opinion. Despite Brooke's disagreements with Nixon, the president reportedly respected the senator's abilities. After Nixon's election, he had offered to make Brooke a member of his cabinet, or appoint him as ambassador to the UN. The press discussed Brooke as a possible replacement for Spiro Agnew as Nixon's running mate in the 1972 presidential election. While Nixon retained Agnew, Brooke was re-elected in 1972, defeating Democrat John J. Droney by a vote of 64% to 35%. Before the first year of his second term ended, Brooke became the first Republican to call on President Nixon to resign on November 4, 1973, shortly after the Watergate-related Saturday Night Massacre. He had risen to become the ranking Republican on the Senate Banking Committee and on two powerful appropriations subcommittees, Labor, Health and Human Services, and Foreign Operations. From these positions, Brooke defended and strengthened the programs he supported. For example, he was a leader in enactment of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which ensured married women the right to establish credit in their own name. In 1974, with Indiana Senator Birch Bayh, Brooke led the fight to retain Title IX, a 1972 amendment to the Higher Education Act of 1965, which guarantees equal education opportunity to girls and women. In 1975, with the extension and expansion of the Voting Rights Act at stake, Brooks faced Senator John Stennis, Democratic Mississippi, in extended debate and won the Senate's support for the extension. In 1976, he also took on the role of supporter of wide-scale legalized abortion. The appropriations bill for HHS became the battleground over this issue because it funds Medicaid. The anti-abortion movement fought, eventually successfully, to prohibit funding for abortions of low-income women insured by Medicaid. In 1976, the press again speculated on his possible candidacy for the vice presidency as Gerald Ford's running mate, with Time calling him an able legislator and staunch party loyalist. In Massachusetts, Brooks' support among Catholics weakened due to his stance on abortion. During the 1978 re-election campaign, the state's bishops spoke in opposition to his leading role. Brooke went through a divorce late in his second term. His finances were investigated by the Senate and John Kerry, then a prosecutor in Middlesex County, announced an investigation into statements Brooke made in the divorce case. Prosecutors eventually determined that Brooke had made false statements about his finances during the divorce, and that they were pertinent but not material enough to have affected the outcome. Brooke was not charged with a crime, but the negative publicity cost him some support in his 1978 re-election campaign, and he lost to Paul Tsongas. In his post-Senate life, Brooke practiced law in Washington, D.C., partner O'Connor and Hannon of Counsel Boston. He also served as chairman of the board of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. In 1984, he was selected as chairman of the Boston Bank of Commerce, and 1 year later he was named to the board of directors of Grumman. In 1992, a Brooke assistant stated in a plea agreement, as part of an investigation into corruption at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that Brooke had falsely answered questions about whether he or the assistant had tried to improperly influence HUD officials on behalf of housing and real estate developers who had paid large consulting fees to Brooke. The HUD investigation ended with no charges being brought against Brooke. On June 20, 2000, a newly constructed Boston courthouse was dedicated in his honor. The Edward W. Brooke Courthouse is part of the Massachusetts trial court system and houses the Central Division of the Boston Municipal Court, Boston Juvenile Court, Family Court, and Boston Housing Court, among others. In 2002, scholar Molefe Ket Asante listed Edward Brooke on his list of 100 greatest African Americans. In September 2002, he was diagnosed with breast cancer and assumed a national role in raising awareness of the disease among men. On June 23, 2004, President George W. Bush awarded Brooke the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That same year, he received the Jeremy Nicholson Negro Achievement Award, acknowledging his outstanding contributions to the African American community. 2 days after his 90th birthday, Brooke was presented with the Congressional Gold Medal on October 28, 2009. On January 3, 2015, Brooke died at his home in Coral Gables, Florida, at the age of 95. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 8, Site 5190, TAC 5, TAC RH.